Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of Huron Pines Connecting to Nature series. We're so excited to spend the next 30 minutes learning with you, especially the day after Earth Day. At Huron Pines, we work to conserve and enhance Northern Michigan's natural resources. Focused in three primary program areas, healthy water, protected places, and vibrant communities, our staff implement projects from river restoration and green infrastructure to protecting special places forever and controlling invasive species populations. If you're not familiar with our work, we encourage you to get to know us. I'm Emily Vogelgesang, Huron Pines Environmental Education Coordinator. Jen Klemm, a Huron Pines AmeriCorps member serving at Huron Pines, will be leading a great conversation today. And before we dive into that, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. Please make use of the chat box for the duration of the program. Your video or ask questions of your own today. We'll be using the poll function, which you'll see as a pop-up box on your screen. Everyone will remain muted, and your video was turned off when you entered. Please know that if you turn it back on, all participants can see you. If you experience any technical difficulties, Colby and Chris are here with us today, available in the chat, by email, or phone. We will also be recording this installment, so if you lose connection, you can watch it later. Today's content includes physical health conversations. Please consult with your physician for any concerns around tick impacts on your health. And finally, I want to acknowledge the incredible funders who support Huron Pines Environmental Education Program. The Great Lakes Fishery Trust, Consumers Energy Foundation, the U.S. Forest Service, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities through the Healthy Watersheds Consortium, and individual donors and supporters like you. And with that, I'm going to let Jen introduce herself, and then we'll dive into this week's topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for another wonderful introduction. I'm Jen. I'm serving with the Huron Pines AmeriCorps as a part of my VISTA service through Michigan Tech, where I'm pursuing my master's in applied ecology. And I'm really excited to be presenting this content to you guys today. We've developed it in association with one of my colleagues at Michigan Tech, Shalyn Gertler, who's doing her research in insect-derived DNA, or iDNA, analysis using ticks and mosquitoes to tell what mammals are present in forest systems based on the blood meals. So we're just going to be talking about ticks and keep it simple. So we're going to cover what they are, their life cycles, how they feed, and how to stay safe. Some tips and tricks. So I'm pretty excited. Kind of creeped out, but excited.
Yeah, this one is going to be an interesting one. You'll probably see me make some funny faces throughout this. So where are we starting, Jen? What are ticks? What do we call them?
So ticks are technically arachnids. I know most of us hopefully will never be close enough to look at their legs, but they are in fact arachnids. They have 8 legs for most of their life cycles. Generally, we're concerned more with hard ticks as opposed to soft ticks. Soft ticks don't usually bother humans quite so much, and they're not quite so prevalent as hard ticks in our area. So we can just kind of ignore those, but there are soft tick varieties that look very, very different. Like you can't see the mouth bits. They don't have kind of a shield. It's very different. And ticks overall can live to about 3 years, depending on the species, which is kind of horrifying. So we're going to start a poll. Have you guys ever had a tick on you? Just to see who's familiar with the little ones.
You'll see this popping up on your screen, and we'll give everyone just a few seconds to chime in on this question. I have personally definitely had ticks on me, both attached and just crawling on my clothes, and definitely have had a handful of pets that have had ticks. Alrighty, so it looks like, holy cow, it looks like about 90% of the folks on the call today have had a tick on them before. So everyone's familiar with them. Most people are familiar with them in some way, it looks like.
Well, that's good. So now you guys can learn a little bit more about those little friends. So as we're looking at ticks, those of you that are familiar with them probably know their size pretty well. But for those of you who aren't, or just a refresher, they do have 3 different life stages, really. So the larva, nymph, and adult. And they do get progressively bigger. But generally, they're going to only stay about the size of a sesame seed at most. As you can see, a dime is pretty small, and the larvae especially are really small. So about the size of a freckle if you're ever looking for them. Which, as just an aside, maybe, keep track of your moles. And if you see a new one, might be worth checking out.
There you go. All right,
Mhm.
so they're pretty small creatures, but it looks like they've got a couple different body elements going on. What are those for ticks?
Yeah, so as you can see with the larva, you can see those 6 legs, like we said. That's just how they start out. And then once they have their first blood meal as a larva, they'll go into a molt and turn into a nymph stage, which then they grow that extra set of legs, which is crazy. And then we have the adult stages, right, that have all 8 legs, and then you have well-defined mouth parts. So on hard ticks especially, they have what is called a scutum. You can kind of see that shield on the back. It's a lot bigger on the males than the females, but it is a really, really good indicator of what species you're looking at. So with these, especially, we're looking at the black-legged ticks or deer ticks, and you can tell because it has that kind of solid brownish black color.
Right.
On their legs, their 2 front legs, they actually have these organs called Haller's organs, which are used to detect things like CO2 and heat, which while they're doing their little questing behavior, which is them kind of hanging out on a blade of grass going like, woo, and waving their arms about, hoping to find something, those organs are actually sensing presence of CO2, and they can like figure out where you were like a day before. Like, it's weird. They're weird. And then in terms of their actual mouth bits, they have a hypostome, and then it has 2 palps that are next to it. And so those palps actually help it, when it does find a host, help it find a spot on the host. So they're additional sensory organs. And then the hypostome is a really fun straw-like implement that actually is what goes into the human body or the host. And it looks like this. So it has these wonderfully horrifying backwards barbs that help keep it in place once it does insert itself into a host. And you can see the palps on either side. They have little sensory hairs and little sensory bits. Generally, ticks don't have eyes, so they really rely on that. It depends on the species, but yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking at when we're looking at a tick. Exciting.
Okay, cool. That reminds me of like fishing spears and how they've got those backwards barbs to latch on when you've speared a fish.
Yeah, kind of life being modeled after nature sort of thing.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
All right, so you talked a little bit about their life cycle. What exactly does that look like for the different stages they experience?
Yeah, so they start out as eggs, which is pretty universal, I think. And then they become larvae. When they're larvae, they're so small, they aren't really looking for bigger hosts. So they usually are staying in low grasses and just looking for like field mice and birds, anything that's kind of looking around. Once they have a good meal as larvae, after about a day, a few hours or so, they can hang on. They will pop off and start molting, which then leads them into the nymph stage. The nymph stage, depending on like which species you're looking at, can last, go through a couple molt cycles or just a single one. But that they're looking for slightly bigger hosts. So like deer, you might get humans, foxes, bigger mammals, right? And then after that, they take a little while to molt, so a couple months to a year, and then they become adults. And then those adults, again, are looking for human hosts, especially females, because they want to have enough blood in them to lay their eggs. And a female tick can lay roughly 2,000 to 18,000 eggs, depending on which species you're looking at. So that's a lot of new babies coming out.
Yeah, wow, that is a lot. So where are they living out these life cycles? Where are we finding ticks?
Yeah, so generally they're just found in grasses. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there that I didn't even know about too much before talking to Shallon about all this. There's the idea that they are parachuting down from trees, like searching for a host, or that they're like fleas and they're just jumping, out of the grasses. But ticks don't jump, and they don't really parachute down if they happen to fall out of a tree. If they happen to be in a tree in the first place, I suppose they could. But generally what they do is they climb up to tall grasses, especially at the nymph and adult level. And they're looking at about waist-high grass or so to do this questing behavior where they're waving their arms out, trying to find a host. And really they're just opportunistic feeders. So whatever happens to walk by is kind of what they'll latch onto. So
that questing term reminds me so much. I feel like they should have some medieval night garb on or something.
yeah, I definitely agree. I don't know where they came up with it, but I love scientists sometimes, like
Yes.
oh, such great terms. And so then they just latch onto a host and do their life cycle. But like when we're thinking about them in an ecosystem, generally most of us are probably like, what are they good for?
Right.
And realistically, not a whole lot from like, from a cute and cuddly perspective or anything else. But they are a really good food source for possums, which possums are super great and super cute. I love possums. Everyone loves possums, and you should. They're so cute. And guinea hens. So that's actually a really good tip if you have a yard and you want to help control ticks in your yard. Keeping chickens or guinea hens are great because they look for them like snacks.
Okay.
And so that's really great. They are also vectors for species-specific diseases, so we'll talk about that in a second, but not all ticks carry the same diseases. So it can help with population control for susceptible species, which is more important in nature than it is maybe for us as humans. We kind of want to avoid that, but for survival of the fittest, it's actually a really helpful thing to have them in an ecosystem.
Okay.
And they can also be indicators for other species in an ecosystem. So one example that I found is rattlesnake populations, right? So if you have lower rattlesnake populations, you'll generally have more ticks in an ecosystem because that means there are more small mammals because they're not being eaten by snakes. And so if you wanted an alternate way to track rattlesnake populations than simply doing surveys, you could use ticks as that indicator. Or using like iDNA where you're actually looking at what the blood meal was of and then seeing what animals were eaten. So they're really cool for that aspect.
Yeah. Okay, so which ones do we see in Michigan then? I'm sure there's thousands of species. Which ones do we have here?
Right. So we generally have about 5, but we only have 4 listed, kind of the top 4 really. So the black-legged tick, which is also the deer tick, which is the one that we looked at before, and you can see how visibly different all these 4 species of ticks are. So really good for identification, to look at those scutums and their legs and all of that. But so the black-legged tick is especially important because it's the carrier for Lyme disease, which is can be totally harmless to some people and can cause a whole host of neurological and neuromuscular disorders for other people. So that's a really popular one that we have in Michigan and one that's especially good to take precautions for. The American dog tick is also on there. The Lone Star tick, and the Lone Star tick also has an asterisk because it's the carrier for alpha-gal. And again, not every tick carries it, but alpha-gal is the disorder that you may have heard about that can cause an allergy to red meat. And make you allergic to red meat for the remainder of your days, and cause kind of this immune response anytime you eat a hamburger or something. So that one can be really, really life-altering. And then the brown dog tick, and they can all carry a whole host of other bacteria too, but those are definitely the 2 main ones to be concerned about.
Okay, so the 2 dog ticks probably do carry other diseases and bacteria that might cause harm, but not really prevalent in humans or something that we need to be thinking about necessarily.
Yeah, and certainly not as charismatic as like Lyme disease or alpha-gal syndrome. So.
Okay, cool.
But,
so how do we know? Like, how do we know where these are hanging out and what's going on with these ticks?
Yeah, so there's actually a really great website. So Tick Encounter, tickencounter.org is the website itself, and it has this app on there called Tick Spotters, which allows you to essentially do citizen science and crowdsource information. So if you happen to be out for a hike and you catch a tick on you, or you just happen to see ticks, you can upload photos of it and upload all the information for that encounter and actually show it. So this is a screenshot that I took the other day while preparing this of our region, which I was really surprised to see that it's high right now, but that makes sense because we've had such nice weather and such a mild winter. But yeah, and so you can see kind of this forecasting window, because you might not think to check for ticks out on a hike. You might check the weather forecast, but not ticks. And maybe that's a good one to add into, especially if you're thinking about going camping or you're thinking about a long hike or field work if you're a student or researcher.
Okay, cool. So if we know the tick encounter index is high right now where we are, what can we do to take some measures and prevent a tick attachment?
So there are lots of ways to stay safe. You don't have to just stay indoors. You don't have to avoid it, right? Like if you're going through tall grasses or higher grasses, like definitely make a note of that. But just keeping on layers and light colors, I'm kind of personally hoping that we can start the socks over pants trend. I think that that'd be a fun one for 2020. We'll have like masks on our face and socks on our pants.
Yeah.
But having light colored clothing is really important. I know when Shallon was going out in the field searching for ticks, they would wear these white suits and they'd have these white drop cloths, and you could just apparently see hundreds of ticks on them. So wearing light colored clothing helps because as we saw, they're very, very dark generally.
Right.
Also, permethrin treated clothing can be really helpful. And I know there are some worries about that, but so on the Tick Encounter website, they actually have a link to either the USDA or one of the government sites that allows you to track safe levels of that. So like if you wanted to wear a baseball cap and permethrin treated socks and shoes and pants, like what is your exposure level for doing that? So that's a really good thing to look into.
Yeah.
And using insect repellents with no more than 30% DEET, because we still want to be slightly environmentally friendly while keeping ourselves safe. And especially when you're thinking about wearing those clothings or applying insect repellent, remembering that ticks generally are going to be at waist level or below. So you don't necessarily need to be applying super high up or around your face area. Generally for most walks, most hikes, you'd be good to apply like to your socks and your pants, but you don't necessarily need to worry about too much skin exposure there.
Okay, gotcha.
And then doing annual pet treatments. So when you're taking your dogs or cats out into nature, or lizards, I guess, too, if you wanted, making sure that they have those flea and tick treatments and vaccines to help keep them safe too, because I definitely wouldn't want to ever take off a dog. I can't imagine that process.
It's not a pleasant experience.
No, I can't. And then just after you've been out, doing daily checks is one of the biggest things too. Anecdotally, there are also, if you take a shower afterwards and throw your clothes in a dryer or just straight up wash them, that can be really helpful too for getting any that have like landed on your clothing. But generally, for disease transmission, it takes 24 to 48 hours before any disease is transmitted. So you have a really good window of time. It's not like they'll instantly latch on. Usually it takes them like 7 hours to even find a good nook or cranny. And then on the left, you can see kind of some of their go-to spots. So inside and behind the ears, belly buttons, anywhere that's warm and dark and like safe.
So they take a lot of time sort of deciding where they're going to go eat dinner, basically.
Right. Well, and if you think about it, they don't have eyes, so they're just kind of going on their senses. What's warm? What feels good? I don't know.
Okay.
And having to find skin, because if you're wearing lots of layers, they're going to be like, oh no, that's another pant leg. Oh no, like a pocket.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay.
And that's also another good thing to check your pockets too, especially if you're wearing field pants. Some of those nooks and crannies they can crawl into. So,
right, yeah. Especially some of the lower cargo pants that, have pockets on your calves and stuff. Okay.
Right. So if you do happen to get a tick on you, again, it's not a super big deal. It's going to take a while for them to transmit disease. If they even have it in the first place, there's lots of things that kind of have to come up with that. Okay. So I know a lot of things growing up, like burn them with fire and put soaps on them and stuff. But what ends up happening with that is you end up agitating them, and they end up, if you put toxins on them, oftentimes they'll end up like throwing up or kind of regurgitating back into you, which, really exciting to think about, right? Which actually increases your chances of getting infection and disease, which is not what you want. So the best way to remove a tick is to just take straight edge tweezers, like straight ones, not kind of those slanted beauty tweezers, but just like normal long tweezers. Go as close to the skin as possible, especially if you can get towards that scutum, and just pull straight out. You really want to make sure to get the head because, again, you don't want that infection. But just kind of pulling and tugging, it might take a little bit because of the barbs, but they should come out just fine if you just pull straight out, and then disinfect the site and then put the ticks in a baggie so that you can identify them, save them, do whatever you want with them. Then you can burn them or release them back into nature, I guess, if you have possums or guinea hens. But yeah, so those are kind of that's the best method to remove ticks.
Okay. I never would have thought of saving them, but I guess particularly, thinking about how some are specifically associated with things like the Lyme disease and alpha-gal. If we can identify the ticks and then, God forbid something happens and we are infected, then we can say for certain that this was a tick that was in fact attached to me at some point. And I think most of us are just like, we get it out and we're ready to get rid of it.
Yep, I definitely am right there with you. But you can also upload it to, the tick spotters and then help with that citizen science too. So a lot of really good reasons to save them despite the ickiness, perhaps.
Right. Yeah, I know our seasonal crew typically keep account of how many they encounter when they're out and about all season.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So kind of as we're thinking about all this, right, and how we're going to wrap it all up and put everything together, really the biggest thing is just staying safe and putting these practices into use. So especially those daily checks are going to be instrumental, even if you're not wearing, even if you don't want to wear insect repellent, even if you don't want to do permethrin treated clothing, that's fine, but just make sure that you're doing those daily tick checks. And, you don't need to panic. Again, they take so long to transmit disease. They take so long to actually settle in. You have lots and lots of time. Okay. So it's pretty good. So is there anything you guys are particularly excited about implementing the area, or about any tips that you're excited about implementing this year?
I am really on board for this tucked in socks. I'm not really good about tucking my socks in, even though I know better, but I think if we're all making all sorts of fashion sacrifices lately, we might as well do the tucked in pant leg.
I think it'd be fun, like some funky socks, some good field pants. It'd be exciting.
Yeah, definitely. We've got Heather noting that she does use peroxide when she is swabbing the area after removing the tick, and so that's a great tip. Thanks for sharing that, Heather.
Yeah, and that's great. Peroxide is good, especially because it does create that reaction, which is going to kind of help bubble anything out. But yeah, alcohol, anything like soap and water, anything that you'd use to clean a wound is pretty good. So.
Susie's saying that she has used treated pants before and that they've worked well. Making sure everyone in your group knows to check their entire body, because we do have that, they can get pretty far in our body, and certainly they're going to usually get on our waist below, but yeah, checking your entire body is important. So those are some great tips that you guys are excited about.
Yeah. Cool. And so kind of as an activity this week, just kind of thinking about what your kit would look like. So making kind of this ticks off kit using materials that you have around your house so that you can actually have it ready for you when you're out hiking this season, so you don't panic. Like, I know one time I was out on a hike and all I had was a field knife with me, and I was like, happened to be the hike that I got 3 ticks on me, and I was just trying to like scrape them off, and it was not good. Would not recommend. So having tweezers handy, bags for collecting ticks, cotton swabs so that you can clean the wound, gels, and maybe insect repellent. Anything else that you'd want would also be great, and just having like a little baggie of it or something.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that suggestion. I definitely don't have a tick kit ready to go, so I'm going to plan on doing that sometime this week. That does wrap up our content for today. If you're looking for ways to get outside, be sure to check out the Stay Connected to Nature page at huronpines.org. We appreciate everyone joining us today. I have just a few wrap-up items, and then we have time for questions. As part of our efforts to understand how we can continue to improve our education programming, we'd appreciate just a couple minutes of your time to fill out an evaluation survey. Chris is going to put that link into the chat box. We have an overview document that highlights the primary information we covered today, as well as some of the additional resources mentioned. Those are going to be sent out to everyone that pre-registered with Chris. If you didn't, email him at chris@huronpines.org, and he will get you that information. Join us next Thursday at 1 p.m. for our last installment in April. We're going to be talking invasive forest species, so all the plant species that we find to be invasive in our forested areas. And then for folks, we will be continuing this into May, and we'll be announcing those topics here soon. All right, Jen, are you ready for questions? And we will tag team these. Okay. The first question, are all of these ticks in the Pigeon River country, so that the Great State Forest just north of us?
I think generally speaking, yes, because they're found throughout Michigan. I know for sure deer ticks are found all the way up to the UP, and Lone Star ticks, I guess too, so I'm pretty sure all of these are within this range. So okay. I would guess that they're found in the pigeon because there are lots of small mammals and birds and larger mammals as well. So
yes, and I think there's several of us probably on this call that could attest to there is a large tick presence in the Pigeon River country. We've got a question about chiggers, and Jen, if you're not comfortable, I can speak to chiggers.
I'm not too familiar with them personally.
So chiggers, and this is coming from a person that grew up in Florida, where we have a lot of, I grew up around a lot of Spanish moss, which is a great home for chiggers. Just like ticks, where we've heard, burn the tick or drown them in dish soap, you hear that a lot with chiggers. Chiggers aren't going to bury themselves in your skin or anything like that. They're going to bite you. You're going to see it. But they're not going to be present on your skin anymore. So they're, it's annoying when you are bit, but they're not. You don't need to put the clear nail polish on. You're not smoking them out, so to speak. They're going to bite you and then fall off or leave. And that is the extent of chigger information that I have. But thanks for that question, George. Jen, can you repeat the information on the app for tracking ticks?
Yeah, so it doesn't seem to be like I guess they call it an application, but it's not really like an app. I couldn't find it on my phone, but okay. Tick spotters, and that's here, I can put it in the chat to tickencounter.org, tickencounter.org, and then and that's just a really nice resource to have. I know that I'm going to use it probably whenever I go out hiking now.
Yeah, it's a great one. And we have Laura sharing the tip that it's important to check your scalp and your hair. And I think any of us with long hair in any way can attest to that. I find them in my hair quite a bit. And also, if you have long hair, having it pulled back when you're out has seemed to help, because it sort of makes your hair denser, so it is more difficult for them to navigate through. I found that they sort of stay on the surface if they do get into my hair, and wearing that ball cap like Jen mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and also again too, if you are worried, if you do have longer hair and you're worried, like taking a shower right after you get back and really washing and kind of washing them away before they can even latch on. So.
Yeah. We have a question from Anne-Marie. We live in a forest area with no tall grass. Are there any other things they cling to? So I think this question of if we're not in a tall grass area, what is the worry level?
Yeah, so they can live in brushes. So especially if you do have like barberries, they do like that microclimate. And since that's an invasive species, that's pretty popular in some forest areas. They can be in bushes and things like that as well. Generally, they prefer grass because it's just easier for transmission purposes. Things walk through the grass as opposed to brush. It's not quite so popular, but they can. I think that they'd be less prevalent in, say, like a hemlock, like a really dense hemlock forest that doesn't have a lot of understory.
Okay.
But generally, it's better to be safe. But even if there's not waist high grasses or anything super tall, even just putting a little bit of repellent or anything on your shoes and socks is probably usually a safe bet if you're worried at all.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for that. I do want to acknowledge that it is 1:30. Jen and I can stay on for several more minutes. We've got a couple more questions that will get answered. But if you have to jump off, we really appreciate you joining us and hope to see you next week. So we've got a question from Carlton. What happens to ticks in the winter?
I think generally they just do a period of dormancy, but they can also probably hang on a host. So their biggest thing is that they search for water. So as long as they have a water source, they would probably be good, which I know I was thinking about how many ticks I've probably carried into my home over the years and like the thought of them in my bed or something, but usually they're gonna search out a water source at some point. And so as long as they have that, I think they're okay in the winter, but I believe they go through probably a period of dormancy, especially while they're molting. And since the molt stage can take anywhere from a couple weeks to several months, they usually are probably going to be molting before then, because when we're thinking back to kind of that life cycle of ticks, the adults are especially active in fall usually. And so then that means they'd be taking their blood meal and then going through that molt stage over winter period here, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So yeah, so I think just probably molting and dormancy is the main thing. If they do seek out a host, it's probably one that they've had contact with before.
Okay, gotcha. And I have one more question coming through. Can you talk a little bit to how they get these diseases that they carry?
Right, yeah. So generally, as larvae, they don't carry them, but it's usually through feeding on different things. So either getting blood from an infected animal or human, and then it ends up being in their bodies and in their saliva, right? They take in the bacteria and they hold on to it, even though the bacterium or viruses don't affect them personally. Okay. And then it's in their saliva when they inject it. So they get it through feedings generally. They're not born with it. It's not something generally innate to a tick. It's just something they happen to pick up along the way. Like with alpha-gal syndrome specifically, I know it. I don't know all the complex chemistry because I am a plant person. I am not an animal person, but I know it's something to do with they pick up like a certain sugar or carbohydrate from another animal, and then when it's injected back into humans, we have an intense immune response to it, which ends up causing some problems with the way that we can then process red meats ourselves. So.
Okay. That red meat one, I remember the first time I heard about it, I was like, holy cow, I have some dear friends who would be absolutely devastated, and I'm sure it would, yeah. We do have a question about their activity levels when it's really hot. So sort of this temperature influence that we see in some other types of animals of slowing down or speeding up based on temperature.
I'm not 100% certain about that. I would guess though, because so when they're in the larval stage, they do prefer lower grasses because of the specific humidity levels and climate. So I think that even they have their own preference and range, like being in a dryer or washer would end up kind of killing them off or hurting them. So I think if it's too hot, I would guess that they'd be less active, depending on certainly probably less movement, less questing activity.
Okay.
But
yeah, and we do have folks sharing that, sort of personal anecdotal experiences that they're there during our hottest summer days out in the field, and I think that that's a great point, and that there likely is that sort of heat threshold, but in our Michigan summers, we don't actually get that hot compared to some other places where these ticks are also found. Cool. All right, that is all the questions that we are seeing coming in right now. Again, Jen and I will hang out for a couple more minutes as we have been if anyone thinks of other questions, but otherwise we really appreciate you guys joining us today and hope to see you next week.
I don't know if I'm like more nervous about ticks now or less nervous about ticks?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of, I think I have a healthy respect for them as just creatures that have found a really cool way to function in this world and certainly been creative. But also, yeah, I think there's a lot of fear, but I think there's a lot of fear around, other things that we might encounter in the wild. So it's sort of that measure of what is the thing I'm going to be most afraid of if I'm going outside.
Right, right. And they're kind of cute in their own way. So
Yeah, I'm really like the questing. Like I feel like
yeah.
we do tree dances with kids sometimes. Like I feel like there's a tick dance in here somewhere.
Yeah, I'd love to see that, like a YouTube video where they put music to ticks doing that. That'd be cute.
Yeah, I feel like that sounds like a good quarantine activity for somebody that studies ticks or a DJ or something. Cool. Alrighty, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. So everyone have a great day and we will see you next week.